There is something in Ethiopia that has never been moved, never inspected, never shown to any outsider in 3,000 years. Not to journalists, not to archaeologists, not to heads of state. Solomon's son brought it there, and Solomon's God said, "Let it go." The Western Church never taught you this, because if they had, they would have had to admit something that changes the entire story you were told about where this faith began. Africa was not waiting for the gospel to arrive. Africa was already holding the covenant 3,000 years ago. I want to begin where the Hebrew Bible begins, not with me, not with Ethiopia, with the silence in the text itself. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 1. The Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and came to test him with riddles. That is all the text gives you. No name, no race, no country beyond a single word, Sheba. In Hebrew, Malkat Sheba, Queen of Sheba. That is the entirety of her introduction. That is everything the author chose to tell you about who she was and where she came from. I have spent years with this passage, and the longer I sit with that silence, the more convinced I am that it is deliberate. The Hebrew is giving you the minimum, just enough to understand that she came from somewhere powerful, somewhere wealthy, somewhere that could produce a woman of enough intelligence and authority to cross a continent and test the wisest man alive. And then it stops. She brought spices, gold, and precious stones. She brought riddles. She tested Solomon with every initiatory challenge she had, and Solomon answered everyone. Then 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 13. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, whatever she asked. The Talmud, in Tractate Bava Batra, chapter 15b, reads that phrase as including a child. The rabbinical tradition that Solomon fathered a son by the Queen of Sheba does not begin with the Ethiopian Church. It begins inside mainstream rabbinical tradition, in the same libraries that produced the Mishnah, predating the Kebra Nagast by centuries. Whatever she asked. Now, where did she come from? This is where the debate lives, and I want to be honest with you about what that debate actually looks like from the inside of scholarship, because what most people have been told is not the conclusion of settled archaeology. It is the default assumption of 18th and 19th century European scholarship, and there is a significant difference between those two things. Here is what the text itself gives us. Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 verse 42 calls her the Queen of the South. He Basilissa tu notu in the Greek, the Queen of the South, not the East, the South. In ancient Hebrew and Greek cosmography, the word South relative to Jerusalem had a specific meaning. It meant Cush. It meant Ethiopia. It meant the African interior. The South Arabian kingdom of Saba was understood in ancient geographic orientation as East, not South. The direction Jesus uses points Africa-ward, not Arabia-ward. Now there is the physical archaeology. I want you to hear this carefully. There is no Sabean inscription, no artifact, no physical evidence linking the South Arabian kingdom to the visit described in 1 Kings chapter 10, not one piece. For 200 years, Western scholarship defaulted to Arabia, and the justification was essentially this. The word Sheba resembles Saba, and Saba was a real kingdom. Therefore, Arabia. That is the argument. Meanwhile, Ethiopia has maintained an unbroken institutional claim to the Queen of Sheba's identity for more than 3,000 years. Not since the 14th century, when the Kebra Nagast was compiled in writing. Before that, in oral tradition, in liturgy, in the structure of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has maintained the same claim since its founding in the 4th century. And in 1931, Ethiopia's national constitution declared the Solomonic lineage as the formal legal basis of the emperor's authority. Think about what that means. A country does not build its constitutional law on something invented the week before. The academic consensus on the Queen of Sheba is not Arabia proved, not Ethiopia disproved. The honest academic position is one word: unresolved. And when two claims are equally unresolved, and one is backed by an unbroken institutional memory 3,000 years deep, and the other by assumptions built by scholars in an era of documented hostility to African historical claims, the question of which deserves more weight is not a scholarly question. It is a question about whose framework you trust. The Quran calls her Bilqis. In Surah 27, beginning at verse 22, the hoopoe bird brings Solomon news. A great queen rules the land of Saba, possessing a magnificent throne, governing a people. Solomon sends her a letter. She comes. The encounter between Suleiman and Bilqis in the Quran is one of the most detailed portrayals of a foreign sovereign in the entire text. She is a ruler of extraordinary intelligence, political sophistication, and spiritual discernment. The Islamic tradition, read through the great commentators, Ibn Kathir al-Tabari Ibn Qayyim, consistently describes Bilqis as a woman of deep spiritual authority who recognized in Solomon something beyond ordinary kingship, something divine. The Bible and the Quran both preserved her. Both gave her exceptional stature. Neither gave her a clear geography. Both allowed the Ethiopian tradition to claim her as their own, and neither tradition has ever provided evidence sufficient to foreclose that claim. Let me tell you her name, Makeda. That is the name the Kebra Nagast gives her, Queen Makeda of Ethiopia, of the kingdom centered in the ancient city of Axum. The Kebra Nagast tells us how she heard about Solomon. A merchant named Tamrin had traveled to Jerusalem to sell gold and precious stones on her behalf. He returned to Ethiopia and told her what he had seen, the king's wisdom, his justice, the temple he was building, the God he served. Makeda could not stop thinking about it. She assembled a caravan of extraordinary gifts, spices, precious stones, and gold in quantities the text says had never been seen before, and she traveled north. Solomon received her. He answered every riddle she brought, and on the last night he arranged a great feast, rich food and spiced wine, and obtained from Makeda an oath. She would take nothing from his house. She agreed. In the night she woke thirsty and reached for a vessel of water. Solomon was there. He said, "You have broken your oath." She said, "Release me from the oath for a cup of water." He said, "Release me from one request first." She agreed. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 13. All she desired, whatever she asked. Makeda returned to Ethiopia carrying Solomon's child. She named him Menelik, from the Hebrew Ben Melekh, son of the king. 20 years later, Menelik came to Jerusalem. He was Solomon's firstborn son, by the woman Jesus would one day call the Queen of the South. Solomon received him and recognized him immediately. The text describes how Menelik looked exactly like Solomon at that age, so much so that the people of Jerusalem wept when they saw the young man, remembering their king's youth. Solomon wanted to keep him. He offered to make Menelik his heir. Menelik refused. He said, "I have been raised in Ethiopia. I will serve the God of my father in the land of my mother." Solomon accepted this with grief. He arranged for the firstborn sons of his most important priests and officers to accompany Menelik south, a gesture of honor, sending representatives of his highest households with his firstborn son. But before the caravan departed, something happened that Menelik did not initially know about. The firstborn sons of the priests had made a decision among themselves. If Solomon's son was going to Ethiopia, if the heir of the king was departing Jerusalem, then God's presence should go with him. They entered the Holy of Holies. They took the Ark of the Covenant. They left a replica in its place. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the caravan was already moving south, and God did not stop it. No plague fell on the priests, no earthquake opened beneath the road, no messenger from heaven turned them back. The caravan moved south. Menelik moved with it, carrying something he did not know he was carrying. The most sacred object in the history of 3 religions, the container of the 10 Commandments, the physical evidence of God's covenant with humanity, toward the continent where his mother waited. That night Solomon had a dream. This is the passage I first encountered in Ge'ez in a reading room at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I was in my late 20s. I was not looking for it. I had been assigned a paper on Solomonic Apocrypha, a comparative analysis of the Testament of Solomon, alongside later mystical traditions. The Kebra Nagast appeared in a footnote. I opened it to verify the citation, and I found the dream. In Ge'ez Seyouna, Tafenkea wed Ethiopia, the glory of Zion, the light of Zion, the presence that rested above the ark, left Israel and went to Ethiopia. In the dream, Solomon sees the sun rise from Israel, brilliant, irreplaceable, the source of everything, and he watches it move south, south, until it rests over Ethiopia. Solomon wept, and God spoke to him in the dream. Do not pursue it. This is my will. I set the text down. I sat with that for a long time. I had spent 5 years at SOAS, learning to read ancient texts through the framework my supervisors had given me. The framework had a clear position on the Kebra Nagast, national legitimation myth, a 14th century political document, useful for understanding Ethiopian Orthodox ideology, not credible as historical source. I had accepted this without resistance. My training said, weigh the evidence, follow the scholarship. The scholarship said this is myth, but I had spent those same 5 years reading 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 6 through 9, the passage where God warns Solomon before the temple is even dedicated. If you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe my commands, if you go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. My supervisors called this passage Deuteronomistic theology, historically reliable, structurally coherent, academically significant, a warning that God's presence would depart Israel because of disobedience. And the Kebra Nagast describes exactly this mechanism. God's presence moves because Israel broke the covenant. The ark goes south because the covenant people, in their disobedience, have created the conditions for God to move his dwelling to the people who will keep it. My supervisors called the Hebrew passage historically reliable. They called the Ge'ez passage national myth. The theological structures were identical. The difference: one was written in Hebrew, canonized by the Western Church. The other was written in Ge'ez and preserved by Africans. I was Igbo. My grandmother in Nasuka had maintained practices that European missionaries had called superstition. I had spent 5 years learning to read those same missionaries' libraries, their frameworks, their categories, their analytical vocabulary, and accepting their conclusions about which traditions were credible and which were not. I had just found the seam in my own education. I opened my notebook. I wrote one sentence. The question is not whether the Kebra Nagast is history. The question is why I was trained to read one set of ancient texts as history and another set, structurally identical, as myth. The answer to that question is not scholarly. It is political. Let me come back to the dream, because the dream is not only theologically significant, it is historically explanatory. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, sacked Jerusalem in 586 years before the Common Era. He burned the temple, he demolished the walls, he took the gold vessels, the silver instruments, everything he could find inside. His scribes recorded the plunder in detail, but historians who have examined those records have noticed something. There is no Babylonian inscription recording the capture of the Ark of the Covenant, no record of it being carried to Babylon. No inventory of the looted temple that includes it, the most sacred object in the entire biblical tradition, the object the temple was built to house, and Nebuchadnezzar does not record taking it. He did not take it because it was not there. It had been gone since Solomon's own lifetime. God had moved it. In the dream Solomon wept over, not to Babylon, not to Rome, not to any of the great powers who would fight over the ancient world for the next 1,000 years. To Africa, to the land where Solomon's son had carried it, to the place God had chosen on the night the caravan moved south. And this is the detail I am still turning over, more than 20 years since I first understood it. 1 Kings, chapter 11, describes Solomon's disobedience, the 700 wives, the foreign altars, the heart that turned. And that chapter comes after the ark has already left, not before. God did not send the ark away as a punishment for Solomon's later failure. God moved the ark first, while Solomon was still king, while the temple still stood. And then, only after the covenant's most sacred object had been secured in a safe place, did Solomon's long disobedience begin, as if God had already arranged for the covenant to be kept before the keeper fell. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion beat Mariam Zion in Axum, in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, one of the oldest continuously functioning churches in the world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained the same claim in the same location for 1,700 years. Inside a sanctuary called the Chapel of the Tablet, There is a guardian, one man, not two, not a committee, not a rotating team. One monk, chosen by his predecessor on his deathbed, serves as the keeper for the rest of his life. He does not leave, he does not travel, he does not give interviews. When he dies, he names the next guardian, an unbroken chain. Back to Menelik himself, 3,000 years. No outsider has been admitted to see what is kept inside. Not archaeologists, not journalists, not neighboring heads of state, not the patriarchs of other Christian churches. I want you to understand what this protocol is. Exodus chapter 25, verse 15. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark and shall not be removed. The object does not travel. The object does not present itself for inspection. The object waits in the same place as it has waited for 3,000 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not hiding something they cannot prove. They are observing the protocol Exodus specified. The object waits, and so does the man who guards it, through every political upheaval, through the Italian invasion of 1935, through the communist revolution that toppled the last Solomonic emperor, through everything the 20th century brought to that continent. Still there. One monk at a time. Still watching. Now I want to show you something that sits in Solomon's own financial record, because it belongs to this story, even though almost no one mentions it. 1 Kings, chapter 9, verse 28. Solomon's navy went to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold. The gold of Ophir, Solomon's primary gold supply. And where was Ophir? No one has settled this definitively. But the strongest scholarly candidates include the East African coast, what is now Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. The ancient Zimbabwean gold-working tradition. The gold networks of the Mali and Songhai empires. If Ophir was African, then Solomon's wisdom was financed by African gold. Solomon's wealth, his ark's final resting place, the woman who tested him and gave him his firstborn son, the direction Jesus used to locate her, all African. All systematically sidelined by centuries of Western biblical scholarship. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I am pointing to a pattern, and I am asking the same question I wrote in that SOAS notebook. Why were we trained to look everywhere except Africa for the center of this story? Let me be precise about what I can say and what I cannot, because I am a scholar, and I know how to be careful with claims. I cannot prove that the object in Axum is the Ark of the Covenant. No independent verification has been permitted, but I can tell you what I know. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not a small or recent institution. It is the oldest African Christian church in the world, founded in the 4th century, older than the Catholic Church's formal authority in Western Europe. It has maintained the same claim, without revision, for 1,700 years. And in that time, no alternative location for the Ark has produced a shred of physical evidence. Not the Temple Mount, not Babylon, not the Ethiopian community at the Elephantine Island in Egypt, not the medieval theories about France or Ireland, nothing. The only place that has maintained an unbroken institutional chain of custody, one man per lifetime, chosen on a deathbed, traced back to Menelik, is Axum. Unresolved is not the same as disproved. And when I look at how Western scholarship handled the Ethiopian claim, dismissing it as myth in the same intellectual era that denied Africa any meaningful history at all, I find the dismissal less credible than the claim. I'm still not entirely sure how to weigh all of this, but I know this. Something is being guarded in Axum tonight. One man, chosen by the man who died before him, who was chosen by the man who died before him. Back to Menelik, back to Solomon's dream, back to God saying in the night, "Do not pursue it. This is my will." And here is what this means. For the continent that has been told for 400 years that the faith came as a gift from somewhere else, that Africa received the gospel, that Africa stood at the margins waiting to be included, I want to say this clearly. If the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is right, and the scholarly debate gives no one the authority to say they are wrong, then the Ark of the Covenant arrived in Africa before Jerusalem fell, before 586, before the diaspora, before the first Christian church was built, before any missionary ever set foot on African soil with a Bible in hand. God moved his covenant to African soil in Solomon's own lifetime. The most sacred object in the history of three religions, the physical container of the Ten Commandments, the seat of the divine presence. God did not keep it in Jerusalem. He sent it south, not as punishment, not as loss, as a choice, a deliberate, divinely sanctioned transfer, told to Solomon privately in the night, in a dream that made him weep. Do not pursue, this is my will. The Pentecostal church in Lagos is not at the margins of this faith. The women who fill the prayer mountains of Accra are not at the edge of the covenant. The believers in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, in Kinshasa, in Abuja, every African Christian who has ever been made to feel that their faith arrived late, from somewhere more important, from someone who brought the light to a dark place. The ark arrived on their continent before the temple fell, before the church existed, before anyone came to bring anything. God chose their soil 3,000 years ago. Grace, I want to speak to you directly now. You have been told in ways subtle and not subtle that Africa received the faith, that the covenant landed on your continent through missionaries and colonizers, that the center of this story is somewhere in the Middle East or Europe, and Africa, enormous, ancient, spiritually complex Africa, was the recipient. But Jesus called her the Queen of the South, not the East, not the North, the South. And Solomon's dream did not send the light of Zion to Rome, or to Athens, or to any of the cities that would later claim to be the center of Western civilization. The dream sent the light of Zion south, to where one monk is sitting tonight, to the continent where your grandmother's grandmothers prayed, where your people were not waiting for someone to bring the covenant. They were already standing on the ground where the covenant rests. I want to give you something to carry out of this tonight. Not a ritual, not a list of steps, a declaration. Because the proof this video promised you is not a piece of physical archaeology. No one has that, for either side of this argument. The proof is this: an unbroken institutional memory 30 centuries deep, a constitutional claim that survived colonization, a chain of guardians, one man per lifetime, traced to Menelik himself, a Hebrew text where Jesus uses the word south, and a God who told Solomon in the night, "Do not pursue, this is my will." That proof is what you hold. If you are ready, speak this with me, not as a performance, not as emotional release, as the precise legal filing of something that has always been true. Lord, I receive the anointing of my African lineage. The covenant did not bypass my continent. It chose my continent. The light of Zion rested on African soil before I was born. I walk in that inheritance. Every generational lie that told me Africa was spiritually empty. Every voice that said the faith arrived late, that my ancestors were waiting in darkness for someone from elsewhere to bring the light. That voice has no authority over my identity. The ark arrived in Africa before Jerusalem fell, before the church was born, before any missionary set foot on the continent with a Bible in hand. In the name of Solomon's God, in the name of the God who sent his glory south and told Solomon to let it go, I receive what has always been mine. Take a moment with that, because that is not something I have constructed for you. That is the logical arrival point of 30 centuries of unbroken institutional memory. That is the conclusion that follows if the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is what it has always claimed to be. That is what it means that the Queen of the South came to test the wisest man alive and left carrying his son, and that son carried the covenant home to Africa. Solomon wept in the dream. God said, "Do not pursue." He obeyed. And Africa has held what God sent there ever since. That is yours. It has always been yours. Somewhere in Axum tonight, there is a man sitting in the dark near something he was chosen to guard. He will not leave. He will not travel. He will choose the next guardian when the time comes. And heaven is still present in the same place it has been present for 3,000 years. What you do with this is your choice. But you know what was sent south, and you know where it rests. Sleep well tonight, or perhaps not. There is always more to find in the manuscripts. We will go deeper next time.